it's about the 20-year history of this phenomenon since Putin, really since the earliest weeks of his presidency, which, as you say, sort of passed a lot of people by. But when we went back and, kind of looked at the archives and the reporting, you see that there's a very deliberate escalation on the part of Putin as well. The subjects that are ended up taken, being taken, Americans, are chosen incredibly carefully. And that we see basically kind of escalated in terms of their profile, in terms of their importance to American society.
Hi, and welcome to Superpowers, the future of global security here on Times Radio. I'm James Heappey, and this week I am joined by Drew Hinshaw and Joe Parkinson, who have written a new book, Swap, A Secret History of the New Cold War, in which they discuss the arrest, captivity, and subsequent prisoner swap of their colleague Evan Gershkovich from the Wall Street Journal. Joe, Drew, thank you for joining us on Superpowers. Although this, for journalists, and I suspect in America, was a very closely followed story. I think in the UK and elsewhere, it was people were aware of it, but not following it quite so closely. So perhaps we could start by just giving a quick sort of summary of what happened, and then there is a ton of fascinating detail about Putin and the way that Russia works and the way that their hybrid challenge to the West is playing out that we can dive into. But before we get started, perhaps the two of you could just give us a sort of rundown of what happened in this episode.
In the years before Putin invaded Ukraine, there was this strange and mysterious phenomenon happening in Russia, often at the airport, but sometimes at hotels, where masked agents in balaclava would storm into hotel rooms, arrest Americans, grab them at landing at the airport, often for crimes that were, if real, they were sentenced to draconian charges or draconian sentences, but often for crimes that were really hard to make sense of, very murky circumstances. Americans accused of espionage or national security offenses that didn't really add up. And we didn't really understand what that was until the arrest of Brittany Griner, the famous basketball player who was eventually traded for the arms dealer Victor Bout, nicknamed the Lord of War. And after that trade, a young journalist who we worked with and who's a great guy came to us, Evan Gershkovich, and said, hey guys, we should really be writing more about this strange phenomenon of Americans and Westerners generally vanishing into Russian jail cells. Something's going on here. And then a few weeks later, he himself was jailed for bogus espionage charges. And Joe and I set out to understand what was behind this phenomenon. And what we found was Putin was collecting, using this very special agency, collecting Americans to trade for Russians. And then the question for us was, well, which Russians? Who is it that he's trying to free in the West?
This was a story that, as you mentioned in your introduction, we didn't choose this story. The story kind of chose us. It washed up on our doorstep of our organization. And it is a kind of a sort of grim irony that it was Evan himself that proposed that we write more about this subject before he became the subject of the story. And, it ended up being a 2-year kind of reporting challenge to try and understand what really is a totally secret world of diplomacy and spycraft and international mediation and back channels, but a secret world that nonetheless says so much about the way that power actually works in our world now, beneath the surfaces.
Yeah, I mean, I was struck by the sort of sheer chutzpah of it when I was reading, your work and you realized that this was so routine that Putin was approving the snatching of Americans in order to trade. That rather surprises when I think the sort of perception of most Europeans is that the one group of people you don't mess with is Americans, because the US government tends to take a pretty robust line on these things.
There was a long time of policy, and the UK upheld it and the US upheld it, from Richard Nixon, and it was called no concessions. If you take an American or a British citizen hostage, our governments are not going to negotiate. We are going to hold the line. We do not negotiate with hostage takers. That was the policy for really a half century, and there were exceptions. Some of us are old enough to remember the Iran hostage crisis at the U.S. Embassy, and there were exceptions. But in general, the U.S. and the U.K. went out in the world saying we are not going to negotiate with with hostage takers, and if you take one of ours, you're going to pay for it. The sad reality for our governments and our countries is that that has eroded. These days, strong men around the world, from North Korea to Russia, obviously, China, they know that if they grab an American citizen, there's a good chance that they're going to get something from it. At the very least, they will get some of the White House's time and attention for whatever's bothering them.
Putin would approve specific targets, individuals that were for snatching, or he would approve a sort of macro thing and you've got permission to go after a journalist. Like, exactly how close was he in the selection of these people?
He's picking people out. He is incredibly well briefed. Before the arrest of our colleague Evan, he had 2 video calls where he discussed this. I mean, he is incredibly aware of what his security forces are doing. And it just shows you the kind of granular control that he really does have over the agencies that are the heirs to the old KGB.
What you see, because the book is of course about much more than what just happened to Evan. It's about the 20-year history of this phenomenon since Putin, really since the earliest weeks of his presidency, which, as you say, sort of passed a lot of people by. But when we went back and, kind of looked at the archives and the reporting, you see that there's a very deliberate escalation on the part of Putin as well. The subjects that ended up taken, being taken, Americans, are chosen incredibly carefully. And that we see basically kind of escalated in terms of their profile, in terms of their importance to American society. In 2018, when Paul Whelan, a former Marine, was arrested, he was the first of a group of former servicemen that were targeted. Brittany Griner, as Drew said, was in a way the case that brought this to international attention. And Brittany Griner was an amazing target, not just because she was a celebrity, but because she also was a political activist, and the Russians realized that taking her would create more and more kind of a polarizing debate inside the US. After they took Griner, and Griner was traded in an advantageous trade for the Russians, a journalist was their next target, and unfortunately it was our colleague.
I mean, it certainly struck me that there's an obvious awareness of how Western media, Western pressure on politicians builds, and, sort of what might seem to a non-Western audience as a really high value bargaining chip, a former service person, actually, because they don't have the kind of media interest that a celebrity basketball player or a journalist brings, they're actually a less valuable chip. And so, it felt very much to me, when I was reading your work, that Putin effectively is playing on our weaknesses. Effectively, he's playing on the fact that pressure builds much more quickly around celebrity, or journalists tend to fight harder in support of their own. And he played on that.
Putin's a real student of the asymmetries between Russia and the West. And I think he's a real student of the Western system. And those asymmetries, as you mentioned, are not only that Putin has an advantage here because he doesn't really have to care about a free media and public pressure. Yes, inside his system, he has to keep certain parts of his security constituencies happy, but broadly, he makes the decisions. He also understands what's valuable in the West. And that explains, I think, the targeting. And, this whole story in a way is like a mirror up against our system. In some ways, it's not that edifying as well, that it's just a fact that celebrities and people who have a public profile ended up becoming more valuable, of course, but there were more resources to campaign for them. And, made it not entirely democratic, which I think Putin was also very aware of, holding a mirror up to our own system.
And Drew, we are the price that has been paid is quite extraordinary. I mean, it's fantastic that Yanukovych is home, but he was traded for someone who had shot, had assassinated someone in the middle of Berlin, And so not only would the US have to compromise in its principles around negotiating over hostages, but also the US had to spend quite a lot of diplomatic capital with Germany, presumably, to facilitate that exchange.
To bring home, and this prisoner swap of last August was the largest in U.S.-Russian history. The U.S. brought home eight people all told, a mix of Americans and others, Russian dissidents. To do that, Germany had to free someone who was convicted of murder and sentenced to life without parole. His name is Vadim Krasikov, and he was very close. He was close enough to Vladimir Putin that he used to visit the firing range and shoot guns with Putin. There's a conjecture that he may have even served as in his personal protective detail. This is someone who shot an exile, a Chechen exile, living in a country, Germany, which prides itself on providing safe haven to people who are persecuted in other countries. And when Russia first started broaching the idea of, we want to do a prisoner trade, and we want you to release this murderer, Vadim Krasikov, that idea was beyond the pale. The House was not comfortable with that idea, nor was Germany. But what Russia figured out they can do is they can keep arresting people, and they can keep arresting people until eventually the U.S. relents. And that's exactly what happened.
And that you wrote that Bill Burns and other senior American securocrats were asked multiple times whether or not a swap for a different prisoner or even just the US would both release. And again, the US system said, no, this ask is beyond the pale. It'd be wholly inappropriate to ask the Germans to release someone who's in prison for such an egregious crime. And yet the dial was moved. Putin's hypothesis was vindicated because he arrested a journalist, huge public outcry, and he got what he wanted.
This is a story, our book, of Russia getting what it wants. And it's a very, in that way, a troubling story. It's one that we in the West don't really have an answer. And I personally, having covered this now for a few years, don't have an easy answer. Like, what do you do as a democratic society, right? Like, you have an obligation to your citizens, who are doing honorable things abroad, being a journalist, being an athlete in another country. These are honorable pursuits. And as a democratic society, you have an obligation to your citizens who are wrongly jailed, not just to leave them suffering and let them languish in foreign prisons. On the other hand, the price for freeing them is really unconscionable. I mean, it's really troubling to free not just prisoners, but there were spies, hackers, all manner of rogues, a real rogues gallery that Russia managed to bring home. And it was not an easy answer. This is just how the world works now. Powerful countries pull these kind of tricks, and the West has to find some sort of response that allows us to uphold our obligations to citizens while avoiding the worst possible compromises.
I'm keen to come back towards the end of our conversation into a sort of wider so what about competition between Russia and the West. But before we get to that sort of the serious punchline in our conversation, the other thing that was just fascinating to come out of your research was the sort of fieldcraft and the paranoia and the way that Putin and his inner circle go about their business. And I'm certain that our listeners, viewers would be fascinated to hear some of what you unearthed. Joe, tell us about the identical conference rooms with the exact same number of sharpened pencils and what that tells us about the way Putin does his business.
So we were not expecting when we, started as, to be frank, kind of Kremlin specialists, just investigative correspondents who were thrown into this story, to find so many Cold War tropes and so many kind of stories that you think would just come straight out of a spy novel. But Putin has been a KGB agent since he was a young man. He still views the world very much through an intelligence lens and a lens of paranoia. And we all saw aspects of that, particularly during COVID with the long table and the isolation and people questioning at that point before the invasion, actually, just how whether he was still completely kind of compos mentis. But what we realized in our research is that paranoia goes goes much, much deeper. So Putin is so concerned about his own personal security and so mistrustful even of his top officials that he wants to keep it ambiguous a lot of the time exactly where he is. We know he has an office in the Kremlin. He doesn't allegedly spend as much time in the Kremlin as he once did and prefers to be in his palaces elsewhere across Russia. But at least according to the American intelligence agency and others that we spoke to, he's built these identical rooms so that when he's photographed, he could, in theory, be in any one of these palaces. And he even goes to the lengths of, at certain points, flying decoy planes from one airport to another so that his own officials would be convinced he's in one place when he's actually in another. It says a lot, I think, about the mentality of the man, that everything is so perfectly kind of confected and configured in this way that nobody actually really knows what he's thinking, what he's doing.
Did that level of fieldcraft, did that predate the renewed invasion of Ukraine, or do you think that's a consequence of Ukrainian long-range capabilities that have emerged since?
There's no doubt that Ukraine has increased his paranoia about his personal protection, but the story of Putin is one story. It's a long. This didn't begin on February of 2022. His descent into increased isolation. There's many points on that road. One of them is the pandemic, by the way. He spent a lot of time during the pandemic holed up reading historical texts about, the ancient status of Ukraine, things that obviously affected his kind of warped historical understanding of where we are today.
We were amazed to find out just how granularly he's briefed about operations as well. I think a big question that everyone's had over the years with Litvinenko, with Skripal, how high does it go? Does it actually reach Putin's desk, or are these just, entrepreneurial senior FSB officials or GRU officials that have been given some kind of vague nod and have decided to take the initiative? With the research that we've done, at least, particularly on the illegals, the spies that Putin ultimately wanted to swap in this massive swap that included Evan and many others, he knew absolutely about all of these operations, down to the details of when they were having children, down to the details of when they were moving and being relocated. Very, very personal details. And I think that goes to his lifelong, frankly, interest in and kind of mythologization of the deep cover Soviet and now Russian illegals as being the kind of Praetorian Guard, the ultimate spies among spies.
Because one person can only do so much. And to be in that level of detail around defense and security and intelligence operations must surely mean there are other areas of the governance of Russia in which he is less engaged. Or is the man just a complete workaholic, holed up in his identical bunkers, sort of working 22 hours a day?
Well, the question for us, and the book sort of raises it, is how much of what Putin is told is true? The invasion, I mean, to give you a good example, it was the FSB, the spy agency, that organized the invasion of Ukraine. The defense ministry, which usually when you're about to invade another country, your defense ministry is pretty busy. They were working normal 9 to 5 days before, in the weeks before Putin invaded Ukraine. It was the FSB that had been given the mission, the assignment of warming up Ukraine's public opinion, identifying potential collaborators, basically creating a fifth column that would take over. It was the FSB that had, told Putin that this will go well. We'll be welcomed as liberators. We'll heal, this artificial division between Russia and Ukraine. And it went really badly, obviously. And we're now, the whole world on some levels, but especially Ukraine and Russia, are now in 3 years into this kind of awful war, coming up on 4 years of this awful war, part of which is premised on just a bogus interpretation of who Ukrainian people are.
It raises quite an interesting question. If you think about, we like to sort of satirize the mercurial nature of Western politicians who can sort of sit watching Fox and Friends with their phone in their hand and sort of make policy on the go live on Truth Social. And that clearly is no way to govern a country. But it is similarly terrifying that Putin, because of his paranoia over his security, it doesn't have a mobile phone, only uses computers that are air gapped, hardly ever accesses the internet. And so he's entirely dependent on others to give him their editorialized version of what is going on. He has no direct access to information beyond, which is every bit as bad as being over-informed and sort of making policy on the hoof as a consequence.
Yeah, it obviously hands an extraordinary amount of power to his chief lieutenants, and there's a kind of a huge competition in the layer directly underneath Putin to be the ones who are in charge of editing the information that ultimately gets to the boss. And as the book shows, he still likes to receive his information in a very kind of old-fashioned briefing paper, type way. And he is also, as far as we understand, he is a workaholic. He does work extraordinary hours, but it's this particular predilection for wanting to know about the intelligence operations. And I think you're right, at the expense perhaps of other policy that he must cede to other people. It's very, very particular about him. And for sure, what we learned during the reporting of this was when it came to the policy of arresting Americans, and then when it came to the trading, Putin was the chief decider and was very, very well briefed.
Did you assess that what motivated the capture of Americans is an anti-Americanism, or is it simply that Americans are the highest value currency?
When this started and we were left to investigate why Americans are being seized like this, in your head, you're exploring these possibilities. Is it, by the way, once you make peace in Ukraine and let us have it, we'll give you these people back. It's a sweetener for accepting a peace deal that makes us happy. Like, what is it? What we came to realize is actually Russia believes very deeply in two modern current government, these very deeply in two principles, reciprocity and symmetry. And what that means is if we're going to release people, it's going to be people for people. And if we've charged someone with espionage, regardless of whether that case is in any way relevant or there's any credibility to that charge, we are going to trade them from someone that you have charged and arrested and convicted of espionage, which means the West, to flee these people, had to find Russians who'd been charged with espionage. And more to the point, the CIA, MI6, they had to help track down Russian spies that they knew Putin would care about enough to release these prized American hostages. And what they ultimately started doing was going around the world and arresting a type of spy called the illegal. These are the ones that you've seen from this show, The Americans, the ones who live in the suburbs, ordinary mom and dad. There was a couple in Slovenia. They claimed to be Argentinian. They spoke to their own children in Spanish. They raised their children in the second language of Spanish. They were Russians. And to work out a prisoner trade, the CIA, MI6, and their allies in Europe had to track down that married couple and other spies like that who are living these unbelievable lives as undercover sleeper spies in ordinary European suburbia.
And it does, to start to sort of look at the big map, the fact that Russia, because it takes decades to cultivate that sort of deep cover in your spy network. So this is not a reaction to whatever they allege to have been NATO expansionism in Ukraine or whatever else. Russia never took its foot off the gas when it came to maintaining an espionage network that could threaten the Western interest. And I think that for all these people who think that this is a sort of temporary resurgence for a Russian threat because of Ukraine, and once the Ukrainian peace deal is done, Russia can be a friend and ally, that just strikes me as a complete nonsense. This is a permanent, sort of deeply institutionalized challenge for the West.
Well, I think that's right, with the exception of a few years during the Yeltsin presidency where everything was just so chaotic during the transition. I think I think there's a school of thought out there that Putin has become increasingly, post his Munich speech, of course, become increasingly sort of antagonistic towards the West, and only from there has been building up more confrontational kind of espionage and security assets against the West. Like, our book shows that's just not true. He was doing it from the beginning of his presidency. He probably would have seen that less as being maybe antagonistic towards the West and more about rebuilding Russia's defensive capability. But when it came to the illegals operations, when it came to these other types of operation and rebuilding the capacity, not just of the foreign intelligence network, but military intelligence and domestic intelligence, it's been one-way traffic since the earliest weeks of his presidency.
Tell us about Menshikov.
Menshikov is the kind of fascinating official that you only really learn about if you're very, very deep into this subject, and yet is probably more powerful and influential than most Russian politicians that we would have heard about, people like Sergei Lavrov. Lavrov, of course, has been around for so long and is the foreign minister that, everybody sees at all the conferences and summits. But it's this group of individuals who are very, very high up in the FSB, and it is the FSB more than the SVR and the GRU, that have been with Putin since the very early days in St. Petersburg. Most of them are born in St. Petersburg, or Leningrad as it was, like Putin, and they remain incredibly close to him. Menshikov himself shares a passion for ice hockey with Putin, and we've all seen the footage of Putin playing in the league. Menshikov's involved in that. He's also in charge of what in some ways is the most important department or directorate of the FSB, which is counterintelligence, which what it really means is regime security, which is the number one priority for Putin. And he had some crazy jobs before he was promoted into that job, including being in charge of the presidential nuclear bunkers. So if you're in charge of the presidential nuclear bunkers, I guess you can be pretty sure that you have the trust of the president. And it was Menshikov who, at the beginning of our book, we managed to get this privileged access to understand that he was the one who actually was sort of proposed the escalation and the operation that led to the arrest of our colleague. And he's someone, again, who people even following Russia quite closely wouldn't necessarily know about, but I would encourage to Google to get a sense of who these guys are and how important they are in the system.
And these, Drew, these are people, these Saviki, the sort of that tight ring around Putin. These are people that are just incredibly good at dancing precisely to Putin's will, or actually are they the people who are able to shape Putin and move Putin in a certain direction too?
I think, look, he's chosen to elevate a group of people, many of them from old Leningrad, his Leningrad days, from the FSB, former FSB people who are members of the security services. He's chosen to elevate these people to his inner circle. He's given Russia a regime that in his mind is the rightful rulers of this vast country. Now with that comes obvious choices. Joe was talking about Menshikov, and this is someone who leads, it's one of the units he oversees. It's called DKRO. It's a unit that has effectively become the shop that orchestrates the arrest of American in Russia. They were behind the arrest of Brittany Griner. They were behind the arrest of Adam Dershowitz. They were behind the arrest of Mark Fogel, a high school history teacher who was exchanged at the early weeks of Trump's presidency. They were behind the arrest of Paul Whelan, a former Marine, who was arrested in 2018. And going into this story, we might have thought this is like a sideshow, like this is a sideshow of what Russia does. But, this is not the center of the Russian state. This is one weird corner of it. But the more we looked at it, we realized the people who are leading this policy of arresting and trading Westerners are at the absolute core of Putin's decision-making. They're the same people who pop up in other domains. And these are the people who run the country on some level. And it just shows you how important that this game of prisoner trading is to be.
Do you have any sense that if a peace deal in Ukraine was done and Trump and Putin built on that that Trump, more than Biden or Obama or anybody else, has got the capacity to move the Russians into a better place?
I was just hearing from a very well-connected U.S. source who put it this way. Trump, there's no doubt he has the ability to control, to bully if necessary, to press, to flatter, to run tough negotiations on whoever his interlocutor is. There's no question about that. The problem is Russia has still not achieved its strategic objective in Ukraine, which is to put an end to this government that he sees as illegitimate and part of a Western plot to weaken Russia. It still hasn't retaken territory that Putin believes was part of the historic Russia, and was wrongly given by the Bolsheviks to Ukraine. It hasn't achieved its war aims, and from Putin's perspective, why would it stop? He's created an economy that runs on war. He believes the West sooner or later will give up, and once they do, there's no way the Ukrainian state will stand against him. On the other side, the Ukrainian state is like, they're still in this fight. They're not conceding this to Putin. So there's only so much you can bully, cajole, flatter. There's only so much negotiations you can do tactically if the core facts are neither side is willing to give up and concede on these crucial central points.
Any chance that either of you would travel to Moscow to cover negotiations?
Look, it's really sad because, Joe and I got into being foreign correspondents not because we wanted to write about how scary the rest of the world is. We're fascinated by other countries. We want to help our readers back in the UK and the US and elsewhere understand what the rest of the world is like and how leaders and ordinary people think in foreign lands. Unfortunately, we find ourselves in a world, which is I find very disturbing, where journalists are a fair prey, where academics, people who go to other countries to understand things, are example that comes to mind. There were two academics who went to China and were arrested there as part of a hostage trading situation a few years ago. They were Canadians, both Ninde and Michael. Those are the kind of people like me and like Joe and probably like a lot of your listeners who go out in the world, not because we want to write how bad or dangerous it is, but because we want to understand it. But we find ourselves in a place where we are a currency to be traded. And I find that here a very unfortunate breakdown in the global order that the idea did.
It's another theme that the book touches on, which is relevant to this podcast, of course, this show, which is the degree to which other great powers or even aspirational superpowers are following Russia's lead and how much they give each other political cover to do this. The sad fact about state hostage taking, which is what we've seen in the case of Russia, is that it tends to work against democracies.
Yep.
Autocracies can, by and large, extract a high price for individuals, particularly individuals with a high public profile or who gain a high public profile during their imprisonment. We've not just seen this from the Russians, although Putin's the primary exponent of it, I suppose. We're aware of this on the part of the Iranians, dual nationals, American Iranians, before they go to Iran. There's a State Department advisory where they should write a will before they even go, and they shouldn't go. Venezuela, North Korea, and China, which has a different strategy here. It uses something called exit bans, where it tries to stop people from leaving rather than just arresting them. This technique's being used more and more, and the State Department in the US now has a classification called Categorization D, which essentially advises that Americans should be aware of the threat of abduction in states that, if they're put together, total the population of a fifth of the world. This is a kind of incredible thing that sort of happened quite beneath the radar. But when you look around, you start seeing it everywhere. So we're hoping for better days. And although we won't be going to Moscow anytime soon, we'd love to be in Budapest for these next talks. One thing that probably will be on the agenda, but you won't find in much newsprint, is a prisoner swap. It's a possibility that they'll talk about that. They talk about this at most of these big high-level bilaterals. It's one of the ways where they can still maintain contact and when they can talk about interests, without sometimes talking about the more intractable questions of who's going to give up which piece of land. And so you can bet that'll be on the agenda.
I remember reading somewhere, I think it might have been in connection with Zahari Radcliffe, who was a British national imprisoned in Iran. And there was huge public support for the British government sort of facilitating her release. And I read somewhere that, the Iranians had sort of figured out that using their sort of bot farms and information campaigns to amplify the campaign for her release increased the leverage that she gave them in the negotiations. And you can well imagine the Russians are incredibly savvy in their information operations. But you can well imagine that once they've got someone with profile, they then get to work on really ramping up the political and media attention and making their bargaining chip worth ever more in the process.
But you have to feel for policymakers in this situation. I'm sure you've been on the other side of this, James. It's like this whole topic is basically one great big moral hazard.
Yeah.
Okay, like there are no good choices, even from our perspective. Like a journalist, or our colleague or our fellow citizen, the minute you start giving them more coverage, you're raising the price.
Yes.
But if you don't give them any coverage, you cede all control to the hostage taker.
Yes.
But by giving them more coverage, you not only raise their price, that when they're ultimately released, you could create more of a marketplace because the price that was extracted was high. But then if you're not going to do anything, what separates our system from theirs if we don't care about the individual and we don't have a public forum where people can campaign and drum up support for their loved ones or their colleagues or whoever it is? So there are no good options. And there were very, very difficult debates and disagreements inside the Biden administration about how to do this and how to proceed, and different kind of, different perspectives on whether to do a deal earlier or whether to do a deal later or whether to not do a deal at all. It's trying to measure how to get the best suboptimal outcome. That's basically what you're left with.
Well, I think you've just described Western liberal democracy and politics very well there.
Pretty much, yeah, in a nutshell.
Struggle to do the job as least badly as you can. Drew, just finally, how many more bargaining chips are there on the table? Are there dozens of people in Russian prisons still available to be traded?
Here's what's so murky about this world is the people you're writing about. I don't know who is innocent or who's guilty or who's not in Russia. What I can say is pretty much very few Americans in Russia have had a fair trial, given the flood of hostility towards the rest that exists in. When Trump and Putin talked in May, they discussed a prisoner trade 9 Americans for 9 Russians. And those Americans, their cases are all over the map. Some of them are dads who they had a contentious divorce. They wanted to go back to Russia to see their children again. As a dad, you can't help but sympathize, at least with our initial impulse. I mean, other things happen. People get arrested, and the circumstances they're arrested in. We as journalists can't say, yeah, that guy definitely did it, or no, that guy, he's clearly guilty. All we can say is the guys, these give out of free tries. And outside Russia, this is 20 Europe in similar predicaments. It's don't we call it a piratic or a new world order, there. Yeah, there's no use. What is the U.S. going to do? Sanction Russia? It's already drowning in sanctions. Sanction Iran? They'd have 50 years of getting around U.S. sanctions. The countries that do it are already the countries that are punished by Western policymakers. You're out of sticks to hit them with. There's a scene in our book where National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan with the Biden administration is like looking at this and saying that, what am I supposed to do? We're already giving Ukraine weapons every day. That are killing Russian soldiers every single day. It's not like some other button that you can press to get really tough on it now. There's no good options here. And it's a reflection of just this kind of messy, dark world that the US and UK and other Western democracies and inside the negotiate.
Drew, Joe, thank you. It's incredibly sad to hear you put it that way, and as Joe said, the moral hazard is clear. You've got people who have been taken for no reason other than to be a bargaining chip, and you want them home as quickly as possible, but the price that is probably going to need to be paid for bringing them home is also very high, and erodes all of our democratic and judicial norms, because invariably the people that are in prisons in the West are there because they deserve to be. It is a fascinating subject that you've written on. Please, if you've enjoyed the conversation, you must go to your nearest bookstore and buy a copy of SWAT, The Secret History of the Cold War. Drew Hinshaw and Joe Parkinson have done some incredible research, motivated by an enthusiasm for sort of following up on the work of one of their own. But also what I think you've both unearthed is the sort of hidden front in this hybrid contest between East and West, and one where what we would regard as our liberal democratic strengths are routinely being used to our disadvantage. So Joe, Drew, thank you very much indeed for joining us on Superpowers. Please do come on again. You're watching Superpowers, the future of global security here on Times Radio. For more of Times Radio's brilliant geopolitical analysis, please make sure that you like and subscribe to the Times Radio YouTube channel. And for now, I'm James Heappey. See you next week.